I'm delighted that you have a show because you're fresh, you're funny, you're great. And I want you to know something. From my heart, I never liked you.
Don Rickles made the biggest stars in Hollywood laugh, then flinch. He was a man with quick-fire jokes, sharp opinions, and even sharper memories. He roasted everyone, but not everyone forgave him. Behind the laughs and standing ovations, some of comedy's biggest names reportedly walked away with bruised egos, quiet resentment, and unfinished business. So what really went on when the cameras stopped rolling? And which comedy legends did Don Rickles roast in unimaginable ways? You'd be shocked to find out who laughed, who faked it, and who never let it go. The rise of Don Rickles. Don Rickles didn't start as the comedy icon we remember today. In fact, his first attempts at show business had very little to do with comedy at all. He originally trained as a dramatic actor and spent years auditioning for serious roles in film and television. But despite his talent, the opportunities just weren't coming. Casting agents often passed him over, and by the early 1950s, it became clear that if he wanted to stay in the business, he needed to pivot. And that pivot came not from the stage or screen, but from the nightclubs of New York and Miami, where he began experimenting with stand-up comedy to make a living. But it didn't take long for Rickles to realize that scripted jokes weren't working for him. The turning point came when he started responding to hecklers in the audience, not with frustration, but with improvised comebacks that drew huge laughs. That raw, spontaneous insult style became his trademark, and it worked. Audiences loved the shock of it, the honesty of it, and the fact that no one was safe. Whether you were just sitting in the front row or you were a major celebrity, Rickles had something to say, and he said it without hesitation. In an interview, when asked how he discovered his comedy style, he said, "To be honest, the insult thing started out of lack of having an act. Many years ago, I stood on the stage and told bad jokes, and did Sophie Tucker as an impersonation, and nobody looked up." Rickles leaned into this style that would define his career. It was a massive shift. He went from aspiring serious actor to comedic provocateur. And he wasn't just insulting the audience, he insulted everyone, including himself, his friends, celebrities, and eventually the biggest names in the entertainment industry. What made Rickles different was his ability to offend without alienating. His jabs were brutal, but they came with a wink and a punchline that softened the blow. Still, it was a risky style. In the early days, many club owners weren't sure what to make of him. But one person who absolutely got it was Frank Sinatra, the man who changed everything for Rickles. In the late 1950s, Sinatra came to see Rickles perform in Miami. Rickles, always fearless, looked Sinatra dead in the eye and said, "Make yourself at home, Frank, hit somebody." But instead of walking out, Sinatra burst out laughing and kept coming back. Sinatra started inviting his celebrity friends to Rickles' shows. Within months, Rickles was performing in front of A-list crowds in Las Vegas. And just like that, he became a headliner. Las Vegas wasn't just a venue for Rickles, it became his kingdom. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Rickles was a fixture at casinos, playing sold-out shows night after night. His performances were part comedy, part roast, and all spectacle. The more famous the audience member, the more savage the insults. No one was off limits. And the more outrageous he got, the more people wanted to see him. By the mid-1960s, Rickles had also become a regular on television. His big break came through guest spots on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, where he appeared more than 100 times. Carson loved him, and so did viewers. He also became a favorite of Dean Martin, joining the now legendary Dean Martin Celebrity Roasts, where Rickles stole the spotlight with his fearless digs at everyone from Ronald Reagan to Lucille Ball. Even the other comedians on stage, many of them legends in their own right, looked genuinely nervous when Rickles stepped up to the microphone. That's how sharp he was. Rickles also found steady work in film. His earliest notable role came in the 1958 submarine drama Run Silent, Run Deep, starring Clark Gable and Burt Lancaster. Though it was a serious role, Rickles stood out. He later appeared in the 1970 war comedy Kelly's Heroes, alongside Clint Eastwood, and decades later in Martin Scorsese's crime epic Casino. where he played a fictional version of real-life casino executive Billy Sherbert. The role showed a different side of Rickles and was a reminder that beneath the wisecracks, he was still a trained actor. However, despite decades of success, Rickles didn't receive major awards until late in his life. In fact, it wasn't until HBO released Mr. Warmth, the Don Rickles Project, a documentary that captured both his genius and his legacy, that he earned his first Primetime Emmy Award and widespread recognition as one of comedy's true trailblazers. But Rickles' rise wasn't without obstacles. His early years were filled with rejection, and even after he became famous, his unique brand of insult comedy came with consequences and controversies. While fans saw him as a legend, others accused him of being outdated, offensive, or even harmful. And oftentimes, Rickles had to navigate a cultural landscape that didn't always embrace the shock value humor he had helped pioneer. Behind the sharp-tongued persona and the sold-out stages, Rickles was also known for being strongly opinionated. And not every fellow comedian was immune to his wrath. Over the years, there were several names that Rickles publicly or privately criticized or perhaps even disliked, and some of these names will shock you. The controversial side of Don Rickles. Don Rickles didn't just flirt with controversy, he built his entire act on it. Long before terms like cancel culture or political correctness entered the mainstream, Rickles was saying the kinds of things on stage that would make even modern shock comics hesitate. But that was his style, and he made no apologies for it. He stood on stage and took aim at race, religion, gender, nationality, and status, all in a single set. And somehow, people kept laughing. They bought tickets, packed casinos, and invited him to roast some of the most powerful figures in the world. At the heart of his humor was the belief that nothing and no one was off-limits. This included celebrities, politicians, and total strangers in the audience. He'd call out someone in the crowd and hit them with a joke, irrespective of their social status or race. In fact, some of his comments could be called racially insensitive at best. In one of his more infamous bits, he said, "I love the Italian people. They eat spaghetti, they swell up, and they die fast." This comment was crude, stereotypical, and exactly the kind of material that got big laughs in nightclubs. But it wasn't just the Italian race he made fun of. Rickles, himself Jewish, often made offensive comments about his race. The key, according to him, was to insult everyone. That way, it didn't feel personal. Rickles always claimed that his intent wasn't malice but was absurdity. He leaned into stereotypes not because he believed them, but because mocking them so openly made them sound ridiculous. It was his way of diffusing social tension through humor. Still, not everyone was laughing. As society began to shift, especially from the 1990s onward, many started to revisit Rickles' older material with a more critical eye. What once passed as edgy or bold was now being re-examined as offensive or outdated. Some moments drew particular backlash. In 2012, at a TV Land Awards ceremony, Rickles cracked a joke about President Barack Obama, comparing him to a janitor by saying, "President Obama is a personal friend of mine. He was over to the house yesterday, but the mop broke." This joke was met with uncomfortable laughter and criticism. While Rickles had made a career of insulting every American president he ever met, this one didn't land the same way. Many called it racially charged, and Rickles' team was forced to address the backlash, with his publicist insisting that Rickles was simply being himself and meant no harm. But if there was one place where Rickles' roast style always thrived, it was on the political stage. He was invited to roast Ronald Reagan at his second inaugural celebration in 1985, a moment that put Rickles' unapologetic style in front of some of the most powerful people in America. Standing in front of the president, vice president, first lady, and dozens of dignitaries, Rickles delivered his set with the same fearless energy he brought to Las Vegas. He looked at Reagan and said, "Black, white, Jew, Gentile, we're all working for one cause, to figure out how you became governor." The room roared with laughter, including Reagan himself. That was the strange power Rickles had. He could say things that, on paper, looked wildly inappropriate, but when delivered with his signature smirk and stage presence, it worked. It was like he had a pass, and even the people being targeted laughed the loudest. Frank Sinatra was another frequent target. Rickles cracked the kind of controversial jokes that only worked because Sinatra loved Rickles. And back in the day, once Sinatra endorsed you, most of Hollywood followed. Rickles never hid behind sensitivity or softened his delivery to match the tone of the times. Even in his later years, when many comedians adjusted their material to meet changing expectations, Rickles stood by his old-school approach. Still, as the cultural landscape continued to evolve, Rickles' style became harder to defend publicly. While many comedians praised him as a trailblazer who broke comedic boundaries, others questioned the lasting impact of jokes built on stereotypes and slurs. Younger audiences didn't always get the joke. They didn't know the nightclub circuit. They didn't grow up in the era of Dean Martin roasts. And for them, Rickles sometimes sounded less like a legend and more like a relic. Yet even in the middle of controversy, Rickles rarely lost the respect of his peers. Comedians like Jerry Seinfeld, Chris Rock, and Jimmy Kimmel praised him for his timing, his bravery, and his ability to roast people in a way that somehow still felt joyful. To Rickles, it was always just jokes. But to the people watching, those jokes sometimes hit harder than intended. He walked a razor-thin line between comedy and controversy for several decades and never once fell off. But while he offended many, not every jab was rooted in hatred. In fact, some were playful and simply designed to get a reaction. Unsurprisingly, Rickles' fellow comedians were often at the receiving end of his offensive jokes. One comedian in particular shared a right: Johnny Carson. Don Rickles and Johnny Carson shared one of the most recognizable friendships in late-night television history, built on humor, respect, and occasional behind-the-scenes tension. Rickles appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson more than 100 times, often unannounced, and sometimes even interrupting interviews with other guests. Carson absolutely welcomed it, and he gave Rickles a platform that few others could match, allowing him to turn casual jabs and chaotic banter into television gold. Their comedic rhythm was unmistakable. Rickles played the aggressive jokester, and Carson played the amused straight man, letting the insults roll off his shoulders for the sake of the joke. But not every moment between them was carefully choreographed. In 1976, while Carson was away for the night, Rickles guest starred on The Tonight Show with Bob Newhart. During the show, he accidentally broke Carson's beloved cigarette box on the host's desk. When Carson returned and discovered the damage, he walked across the NBC studio lot, barged into the taping of Rickles' sitcom, and confronted him on camera. The moment became a piece of late-night legend, replayed for decades as an example of genuine chemistry and unscripted television at its best. Despite the laughs, there were rumors that not everything between them was cordial. Some rumors have suggested that Rickles may have been privately frustrated over being passed up for the Tonight Show hosting gig when Jack Paar stepped down in the early 1960s. The role eventually went to Carson, and while there's no confirmed bitterness from Rickles himself, industry speculation and rumors have long hinted that he believed he was overlooked due to his brash style. Whether true or not, it never showed on air, and their friendship continued until Carson's retirement, with Rickles remaining one of the few guests who could truly catch him off guard. Even after Carson left television, Rickles often spoke of him fondly, referring to him as a genius and a giant of comedy. But as Carson exited the stage, the late-night world moved into a different era, and Rickles found himself in a different rhythm with the comedian who supposedly took over from Carson, Jay Leno. When Jay Leno took over The Tonight Show in 1992, Don Rickles remained a frequent guest, but the dynamic between them never quite mirrored the easy rapport Rickles had enjoyed with Johnny Carson. While his appearances on the show remained frequent, the tone was noticeably different. Rickles often used the platform to mock Leno to his face, taking jabs at his delivery, his haircut, and even the time he made Rickles wait backstage. On one occasion, Rickles sarcastically quipped about being trapped in the green room like a prisoner, later joking that he felt forgotten while younger guests were prioritized. The audience laughed, and Leno played along, but to some fans, there was a visible tension underneath. Leno maintained his composure, but Rickles never hesitated to call out what he perceived as the more corporate or sanitized version of The Tonight Show under Leno's leadership. While Carson had a certain looseness and spontaneity that gave Rickles room to dominate segments with his wild energy, Leno's more structured approach didn't always leave the same space for Rickles to roam freely. Some critics and longtime fans of the Carson era noted this shift. The laughs were still there, but to them, the comfort wasn't. Rickles occasionally made reference to how things had changed since Carson's time, sometimes in passing, other times with pointed sarcasm. It wasn't that Rickles disliked Leno, but there was a clear sense that the magic of late night, as Rickles had known it, had faded. Even as he remained a sought-after guest, the rhythm felt slightly off. Leno, for his part, never publicly pushed back. He seemed aware that Rickles came from a different era with fewer filters and more raw energy, and he allowed the jokes to roll off without reaction. The two continued appearing together until Rickles' final years, with Leno often praising Rickles as a legend, despite the sharp on-air barbs. While Rickles maintained a presence on Leno's show, it was clear that The Tonight Show was no longer the playground it had once been for him. And when he encountered other comedians in the spotlight whose styles clashed directly with his, things didn't always stay civil. Bob Hope. Don Rickles and Bob Hope shared the same comedy stages, but not the same approach. By the time Rickles began rising in the comedy world, Bob Hope was already an institution and an elder statesman of American entertainment known for his tightly scripted monologues and political humor. Hope's style was polished, controlled, and built for wide appeal. Rickles, on the other hand, thrived on chaos, spontaneity, and confrontation. And nowhere was that contrast more visible than during the Dean Martin celebrity roasts. Rickles took full advantage of the roast to target Hope's carefully curated public persona. He mocked Hope's reliance on cue cards, his dated jokes, and his constant need for approval. The digs were relentless, but delivered with such comedic precision that even Hope had to laugh. The roasts gave Rickles free rein, and Hope, like every guest, had no choice but to sit and take it. What made these moments stand out was how boldly Rickles went after a man many in Hollywood treated with reverence. Hope was rarely challenged publicly, but Rickles didn't hesitate. He saw in Hope an example of what comedy used to be: safe, structured, and heavily filtered. But Rickles' entire act was built on breaking from that mold, and so his jabs at Hope often felt like a generational clash in real time. Interestingly, Rickles wasn't the only late-night fixture who had reservations about Hope. Johnny Carson, who had inherited the mantle of late-night comedy, reportedly shared Rickles' frustrations. According to various accounts, Carson disliked Hope's frequent appearances on The Tonight Show, especially because Hope often insisted on scripting everything in advance, including Carson's own responses. That went against Carson's more improvisational instincts, and Rickles, who thrived on the unscripted, likely felt the same way. But when it came to throwing shade, Rickles didn't reserve his jokes for old-school men. In fact, he had just as much firepower for sharp-tongued women. Joan Rivers. Don Rickles and Joan Rivers operated in the same circles for decades, and though they shared more in common than either would admit, their on-air exchanges were often cutting. Both were quick-witted, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore in a room full of stars. When the two appeared together on talk shows, things rarely stayed polite. Rickles would jab at Rivers' appearance, her voice, or her famously frequent plastic surgery. Rivers, never one to stay quiet, fired right back, often mocking Rickles' age, his style, or his outdated haircut. What made their back-and-forth dynamic so unique was that it didn't feel staged. The banter was fast and sharp, and neither one pulled punches. Audiences loved it because it felt like watching two comedians battle it out in real time, without a script or safety net. Despite the constant digs, there was no verified personal feud between the two. Both comedians respected each other's place in the industry and recognized the value of having someone just as sharp on the opposite side of the table. While Rickles often targeted women in his comedy, something that drew criticism over time, Rivers was one of the few who matched his pace and ferocity. She didn't just take his insults, she threw them right back, often louder. Their rivalry was more theatrical than personal, and both used it to fuel appearances that kept audiences talking. They were, in many ways, reflections of each other. Old-school comics who said the unsayable, drew laughter from discomfort, and never adjusted their style for the sake of public approval. As the television landscape evolved, their brand of insult comedy became rarer, but together, They represented a golden age of comedy, where the line between admiration and aggression was paper-thin. Still, not every comedian was able to hold their own with Rickles. And in the case of one star in particular, things didn't stay playful. Instead, they turned into open discomfort, both on stage and off. Red Skelton. Red Skelton was one of the most beloved figures in mid-20th century American comedy. His style was warm, sentimental, and heavily based on character work, clowns, hobos, and gentle souls who connected with families across generations. Don Rickles, on the other hand, had built his act on speed, sting, and insult. The two comedians couldn't have been further apart in tone, and according to some reports, Rickles often viewed Skelton's style as outdated. In his routines, Rickles occasionally poked fun at sentimental comics who leaned too heavily on pathos, and though he rarely mentioned names, Skelton's brand of gentle humor seemed to be a clear target. There's no confirmed evidence of open hostility between the two, but their paths did cross in unexpected ways. One point of indirect connection came with the 1963 ensemble comedy It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. Skelton had reportedly been invited to join the film but declined due to scheduling conflicts or possible creative differences. Rickles, who was not in the final cast, had allegedly expressed interest in joining the project, and some accounts suggest he was disappointed when he wasn't included. The film featured nearly every major comedian of the era, from Milton Berle to Sid Caesar and Jonathan Winters, but Rickles was left out. Whether Skelton's absence influenced that lineup is unclear, but the overlap adds an interesting layer to their professional distance. Rickles' humor often operated as a rejection of Skelton's entire comedic philosophy. Where Skelton offered whimsy and nostalgia, Rickles delivered confrontation and discomfort. In interviews and on stage, Rickles would sometimes comment on how some comedians were afraid to hurt feelings, a remark that many took as a veiled shot at comedians like Skelton, who prioritized heart over edge. Still, both men had long careers and dedicated audiences. Skelton was a favorite among older generations and conservative viewers, while Rickles appealed to those craving something more raw and unscripted. They represented two very different visions of what comedy could be, and Rickles never shied away from drawing that line. But if Skelton represented the soft edges of comedy, this next comedian stood on the other end of the spectrum entirely. Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce and Don Rickles emerged in the same era, both challenging the boundaries of comedy, but in vastly different ways. Bruce was known for his confrontational, socially conscious routines, often tackling religion, race, obscenity laws, and American hypocrisy, with a bluntness that landed him in courtrooms nearly as often as it did on stage. Rickles, on the other hand, while equally unfiltered, took a completely different route. His material wasn't political, it was personal and built around direct confrontation with whoever happened to be in front of him. The two comedians represented diverging schools of thought, with one rooted in cultural critique and the other in pure provocation for laughter's sake. According to industry speculation, Rickles reportedly admired Bruce's impact but didn't always connect with the material. Bruce was a pioneer and understood that Bruce had opened doors for comedians to speak freely, but their styles were very different. And Rickles wasn't a fan of Bruce's vicious jokes. Their comedic philosophies rarely overlapped. Bruce would spend long segments dissecting systemic problems and challenging taboos, often without a punchline in sight. Rickles, on the other hand, wanted laughs every 10 seconds. His goal wasn't to provoke thought, it was to dominate a room, knock people off balance, and get them to laugh in spite of themselves. If Bruce was the professor, Rickles was the heckler in the back of the class. To fans, it's clear that Rickles kept his distance from the kind of comedic activism Bruce embodied. He didn't engage in political rants or commentary. His act avoided serious discourse entirely, and that may have been intentional. Rickles knew his lane and stayed in it. He left the courtroom battles to Bruce and stuck to insult-driven chaos that worked in clubs, casinos, and television studios. Even so, their parallel rise shaped the comedy landscape in different ways. Bruce pushed the boundaries of what could be said. Rickles pushed how it could be said. Howard Stern. By the 1990s, Don Rickles had cemented his status as a comedy institution, but not everyone was impressed. A clear example was Howard Stern, the brash, uncensored radio provocateur who dominated shock jock culture and made a career out of calling people out, including comedians who came before him. Stern reportedly took aim at Rickles on multiple occasions, dismissing his style as outdated and not funny during various radio segments. Stern's critique wasn't subtle. He framed Rickles as a relic of another era, a man whose rapid-fire insults didn't quite land in the modern media landscape. The jabs hit hard, especially coming from someone who had built his entire brand on aggressive honesty. Rickles never fired back at Stern publicly, because that wasn't his style. But among fans and insiders, there was plenty of speculation that Rickles was less than thrilled by Stern's digs. Rickles, for all his stage bravado, valued showbiz tradition. He was loyal to formats like The Roast, The Variety Show, and The Vegas Residency. On the other hand, Stern's brand of unfiltered radio, filled with graphic content, raunchy interviews, and a deep disregard for showbiz decorum, stood in total contrast to the world Rickles came from. The tension between them wasn't just personal, it was generational. Rickles came up during a time when comedy was scripted, rehearsed, and polished. Whole Stern thrived in chaos, broadcasting raw and unsanitized material to millions every morning. For Rickles, the stage was sacred, but for Stern, nothing was off-limits, including mocking the very legends that audiences revered. And yet, when Don Rickles passed away in 2017, Stern's tone shifted dramatically. Stern offered a sincere tribute to Rickles, calling him one of the greats and recalling the impact Rickles had on comedy. It was a rare moment of humility from Stern, and it raised eyebrows, especially among those who remembered the earlier criticisms. Whether it was genuine admiration or a respectful nod to a fallen icon, Stern's change in tone spoke volumes about Rickles' legacy. Even the loudest critics knew when they were standing in the shadow of a giant. Rickles may not have replied to every insult, but his silence spoke as loudly as any comeback. And in the end, even those who mocked him couldn't deny the impact he left behind on the comedy world. Were you a fan of Don Rickles' style of comedy? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.